DEF CON here at Monero Village with the one and only Dr. Daniel Kim of Sweetwater Digital Asset Consulting. And it's really a pleasure to be talking to you. We had you speak at CocaCola this past year, and I remember everyone was just like, you were being pulled left and right just to talk to all these people and to give interviews. And we finally, and your time was so consumed giving all of our guest interviews on our Coco that we finally meet you here at DEF CON to finally sit down and talk to you. During your talk, you talked about how Monero is the best currency for the person that wants to invest in crypto and wants to be a squeaky clean investor. And if you could please shine light on that, that would be incredible.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rafael, for doing this interview. And yeah, we're sort of at a halfway point between Nakamoto, certainly in August of 2019 here. And I guess I should probably make a disclaimer first. So, as the president and founder of Sweetwater Digital Asset Consulting, I advise clients who have long positions in Manero and to a much smaller extent in Bitcoin and its associated forks. Also, I'll be talking with you with my personal thoughts and opinions, and these aren't financial or legal advice. It should be obvious to everyone. So yeah, the talk that I gave here at DEF CON was the keynote speech, the first one on Friday morning, and it was an overview of why Nakamoto Consensus is important to the world, an outline of Bitcoin and how Manero takes many of the best aspects of Bitcoin and extends and I think improves on many other aspects. And also the consequences of this for investors who are not really trying to become squeaky clean investors, but actually are squeaky clean investors. They're the ones who, it's just no question that they're going to be compliant with the laws and regulations in their particular jurisdiction. It tends to be the case for, I would say, higher net worth people who really enjoy their freedom, and the risks associated with non-compliance are just too threatening to bear. So the strategy is then compliance, full technical compliance with all the applicable laws and regulations. Yep.
How does Monero make it that it becomes a cryptocurrency, or the cryptocurrency that allows you to become a squeaky clean compliant investor? It seems almost counterintuitive, and there's been a lot of noise within this space, especially coming from the BSV crowd, where accountability and having surveillance of the blockchain is something that they see as a precursor to being compliant with government. And you have you've been able to shine light on the fact that actually that is counterproductive to the person that wants to be a quickie clean investor. So what about Monero allows you to become a compliant investor?
Sure. So first of all, the FinCEN guidance which is FinCEN obviously being the anti-money laundering and KYC branch of the Department of Justice, but they came out in 2013, I believe it was, with guidance as to kind of what they see as being a compliant cryptocurrency. So they have several requirements. One of them is that all of the rewards that are given are decentralized and they go to the miners. So basically it was kind of describing Bitcoin, the system in which you have a decentralized network of computers doing accounting work for the value token. And if you have a situation in which the users of that network are contributing their fees directly to this decentralized network that does kind of some sort of proof of work scheme, then that network is kind of deemed to not be involved in kind of money transmission. This would be in contrast to a situation where you just have a company that's saying, hey, I'm going to set up a ledger, send me money, and then I'm going to credit different customers. That would be a money transfer. But this FinCEN guidance described a set of cryptocurrencies in which you can't really identify a subgroup of people who are benefiting from the income that the system generates. So actually, there's actually a very small number of cryptocurrencies that are compliant with this, and that would include the Bitcoin and its forks, Litecoin, Manero, Dogecoin, but any sort of, for example, a staking system, which has something like master nodes that kind of provide anonymity services. You could argue that those nodes are engaged in money transmission because they get a disproportionate reward for doing some service. Any sort of cryptocurrency that has a dev tax or otherwise shunts off miner fees that sends them not only directly to miners but to a centralized pot of money that then gets used to fund whatever. Like it could have very sort of high-minded motivations for doing that, but at the end of the day, you still have this pot of money that is coming from users that's getting used, it's getting controlled by somebody. So things like this would be in potential danger of being declared under consent guidance as money transmitters, not true virtual currencies under consent guidance. So number one, Manero satisfies that. As we all know, Bitcoin, I think when Satoshi started Bitcoin, Satoshi was putting together some very interesting ideas from very different fields. So you have cryptography, you have distributed systems, and you have the game theory of miners who engage in proof of work to competitively and collectively come up with the next stage of accounting, the next block that goes into the blockchain. So Satoshi could not have known back in 2008 when the white paper came out, this was going to be a success. So he needed an initial network of geeks who were willing to download the software, run it, test the tires. Like if we were some of these early geeks, I'd say, okay, I just sent you, 5,000 Bitcoin, because back then it had zero value, right? And I think it's good to kind of, when you're first getting your head around cryptocurrency, to rewind yourself back to like 2009 when things had no value. Because nowadays, now we know that all the projects have a market cap and all that. It tends to trigger like all sorts of unhelpful things, like like about investing and like the greed and fear kind of opposite ends. It's nice to go back to that goes back to the early days where you can just focus on the technical details and not get caught up with the price movement. So back in those days, you had just a group of volunteer geeks running the Bitcoin software on their computers, kind of kicking the tires, trying to double spend, and if you have a collection of geeks who are trying to test out a system like that, you want it to be fully transparent. You want it to be so that, like, look, dude, I just sent you 5,000 Bitcoin. I see you got it. Don't be telling me you didn't get it, right?
How did he come to this conclusion? Was this via mere induction or deductive reasoning, or was it actual? Do you actually know of a place on the internet where this is?
It's speculation on my part,
okay.
But I think it seems because like the other decision, if you could try to put yourself in Satoshi's shoes, would be to make something that was more like Manero, more like a situation in which the blockchain is encrypted, but for a person who has value tokens and their own private key, you can then decode the blockchain, and then the transactions that you personally were involved in become decoded, but everything else is still encoded. So that's an extra step of kind of verification. If you think of what if Satoshi had declared Manero on the world back then.
Right.
It might be harder to get that initial level of buy-in, and it could still get done.
It could get done, but you make a lot of sense. Wow, I never thought about that before.
Yeah.
But now that you reverse engineer your reasoning for me, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now fast forward 10 years, right? So now we know that Nakamoto Consensus works. We now have 10 years of history of Bitcoin blocks happening every 10 minutes. But now this radical transparency, which I think was put into Bitcoin just as a kind of a means to promote that initial like bootstrapped testing process among a network of decentralized computer enthusiasts. Now that radical transparency is coming back to harm the little guy. So now we know that in Bitcoin, it's like a dollar bill that you, just to analogize, it's not like a dollar bill, obviously, but think of a dollar bill in which you flip it over, and then there's like a neat table that shows exactly who owned that dollar bill for like the last 10 years, and you're the last person on it.
That's horrible.
Yeah.
A complete surveillance, yeah.
Yeah, it is rather creepy, and here's the problem, is that there are companies like Chainalysis whose job it is to associate names and faces with Bitcoin addresses. So as we all know, once transactions are entered into the Bitcoin blockchain, you have massive amounts of hash power that guarantee that those results will not be changed in the future. So basically the transactions of Bitcoin are etched into stone. The thing is that you have these pseudonymous addresses. You don't have names and faces. But the fact that this stuff got etched in stone means that if it's your job to figure out names and faces behind every Bitcoin address, you've got all the time in the world. Right? Like it's just sitting there and it's growing. Every 10 minutes it grows a little bit. And now you can just, like sit back on your own time. You can add little pieces of information and figure out who's right. And there are people doing this, right? And so at this point you have companies who offer a product that basically you type in a Bitcoin address and it kind of gives you like a credit report. Like, we think that this address has this % probability of being associated with something not so good. The little guy does not have access to this.
Right.
So you're in a position where the little guy is liable for false accusation and suspicion, just in case they happen to receive Bitcoin, which, unbeknownst to them, came from somebody who is doing something quote unquote shady, whoever's defining shady. Right? So, for example, you sell your car to me, and unbeknownst to you, I did something bad. I give you Bitcoin. Right? From your point of view, it was a good faith deal. Why should you be required to do a full investigation on the guy you're selling your car to?
Right.
Just car. But the problem is, if you get tainted Bitcoin in exchange for your car, now you go to like a Coinbase or something like that, just like you want to liquidate your Bitcoin, fiat that you can use day to day. All of a sudden you get an email from Coinbase saying, sorry, we've closed your account, and you have no recourse. You are, from Coinbase's point of view, you might be innocent, but for you to prove you're innocent, it's going to take up a lot of their support time. So, and then they're playing a numbers game. So it's like if you trigger one of their red flags, they have no incentive to like sit down with you and help you prove your name. You're just out. And then because you linked your bank account information with Coinbase, now those two could talk. And then the next week you might get a letter from your fiat bank saying, we've received some disturbing news about you. We're going to close your account. So like it's like this whole cascade can happen in which you're innocent, but in Bitcoin, the thing is, because it's radically transparent, you are not just transmitting value in Bitcoin, you are transmitting reputation as well. And that is it's just a very profoundly disturbing insight. Because, if you think of fiat for all of its flaws, and of course, I know that the crypto-pulco and anarcho-pulco audience is acutely aware of the many flaws in the US dollar. At least when I give you $50, you do not have to examine that $50 bill for evidence of past wrongdoing. Right. Like you are not given a burden of investigation, and that exists now in Bitcoin. So this is how Manero comes in. And one of the things I talked about in my keynote address at DEF CON this year was a Nobel Prize winning paper by George Akerlof. And he published this back in 1970. He got the Nobel in Economics for it in 2001. And if you bear with me, I'll just kind of
please. It's a good paper. Yes, go for it, of course.
So Akerlof examined the market for used cars. So if you think about people who are selling used cars, you can put them in two categories. One category is the used car owner who's done a good job of taking care of their car. They've done all the oil changes, they've done the maintenance, they've got a good one. Right? And they're kind of doing this partly because they hope to be rewarded for this when they go to sell their car.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have the lemons of the market. Like these could be like cars that were in a wreck, cars that were kind of abused, they didn't get any maintenance done. Maybe they're in a flood or something like that. But of course, the lemon sellers are going to make sure that that paint job is really shiny because they're going to try and sell it. Now, look at the situation from the other perspective. So this is that of the buyer. So the buyer is, the average buyer is not a mechanic. Right? So the average buyer says, hey, I've got this assortment of used cars that I can choose from. But if I knew that I was going to get a cream puff car, which I believe is the lingo in the car industry for like a really good used car. So if I knew it was a cream puff, I would pay a high amount. If I knew it was a lemon, I'd obviously pay a much lower amount. But I know that I have imperfect information about the status of the car that I want to buy. So therefore, I'm going to make a probabilistic assessment. If I think there's a 20% chance that I'm going to get a lemon, then my offer price is going to be basically 20% in between the high price and the low price. So that's what I'm comfortable paying in this market in which I'm self-aware of my ignorance of the desirability status of the products that are being offered to me. All right, so now let's ping pong back to the seller's side. Right? The sellers look at this offer, this incoming offer from somebody who wants to buy a car. Think of it from the lemon seller's point of view. I got this lemon that's worth like a low amount of money, but I got this guy here who's offering me like almost as much as a good car's price, right? Just a little less. So the lemon seller is pretty happy about this. Imagine, like here's another sucker, right?
Right.
So that deal is going to happen. Like the lemon seller is going to say, "Good deal. I will meet your offer price," and that deal happens. The cream puff owner sees this offer price and comes to the opposite conclusion. They're going to feel kind of that their hard work is now unappreciated, right? Because they've done the work to do the oil changes, they've done all this stuff. They're expecting to be rewarded for that good behavior. But instead, here you have this buyer who's like trying to be cheap, right? So those sales are not going to happen. So now you have this feedback loop in which, because of the assessment of the buyer that they might get a lemon is probabilistic, they hedge their bets and offer lower than cream puff price. Then the sellers see that, and then disproportionately lemons will get sold. Right? Now the buyers are going to see that. They're going to say, hey, my buddy just bought a used car and he just got screwed. He just got like this car that like fell apart after 100 miles. So I'm going to adjust my probability. I don't think it's a 20% chance I'm going to get a lemon. Now I'm thinking maybe it's more like 30% chance I'm going to get a lemon. So now the offer price goes down. And it goes back to the other side. And even more of the good quality product people are disillusioned.
Right.
And even more of the lemons keep selling. Because even though the offer price is going down, they're selling just a junky product, and they still have offers coming in that they profit off of. They still have suckers coming in. So lemons are getting sold. The cream puffs are not getting sold. And so you have this feedback loop in which the probability of getting a lemon increases, the offer prices go down, and that causes even more lemons to get sold.
Right.
So that the end result of this is that the good sellers leave the market, and it's a race to the bottom in which only the lemons remain.
Wow. This is incredible because it's completely the opposite of the argument that they've been making on the other side, the transparency coin argument. And what they say and what they reason is that you surround yourself with people who are driven to illicit activities, the more you surround yourself within privacy coin networks. And what this is showing actually is that there will always be a tainted coin market in Bitcoin, that is the lemon market in Bitcoin, which will drive away squeaky clean Bitcoiners.
Exactly.
right? And there's already a premium, like you said, between virgin Bitcoin and non-virgin Bitcoin, right?
Yes, exactly. So yeah, the one reason that this economic insight is so interesting is that it does fly in the face of claims from, I hate to say it, but it's often Bitcoin maximalists who are trying to make a case that it's the undesirable elements of society who are not part of our group, they're part of that group over there, and then they point at Manero.
Right.
And to my knowledge, there's not a Nobel Prize winning economic theory to justify that. It's more of an emotional appeal. And I hate to say it, it's often, I think, motivated by things other than, like, motivated by perhaps profit-driven kind of motives. I mean, if it's your community, I guess you can think that it's in your interest to let the authorities know that the bad guys are over there. But this paper is saying the opposite, is that the people with pristine reputations to protect, who and have worked hard to get those reputations, they are going to be unwilling to engage in a transparent system in which they can be falsely accused of association with bad entities. And this argument from the Bitcoin maximalist crowd is, I think, faulty also because any community is going to have quote-unquote clean and quote-unquote unclean participants. Any network, it's going to have both. And it's not a group thing. At least in America, it's not a group thing. There's such a thing as individual responsibility, right? If a squeaky clean investor is fully compliant, and yet they participate in a network like Manero, which is private, you can't assign the badness of any other participants in that network to them. There's such a thing as innocent until proven guilty. One does not become guilty by joining. You don't become guilty by association. That's just a fundamentally un-American kind of thing to think.
Right.
And yet that is the heart of that argument. Right? Is that there's sort of reputations that blanket an entire group of people. That should be just a completely offensive idea to, I think, the people who tune into this podcast.
Yeah, especially to something so liquid, the most liquid of assets and of goods, which is money, currency, right? And the compliance with law. You talked about a European law that necessitates for a monetary network to have levels of privacy for its users. And Monero completely complies with that. This is a European law you were talking about, correct?
Yes, it is. And yeah, the U.S. and the European side tend to have slightly different imagined perceptions of who to worry about when it comes to privacy. On the U.S. side, we tend to worry that governments are going to have too much information on people. But in Europe, it's a bit different. They are more concerned that corporations and companies are going to have too much information on people. The reality, of course, is that it's probably best if neither governments nor corporations have pervasive kind of spying capabilities on just innocent people trying to live their day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm.
But in Europe, the concern was such that they passed this law that kind of mandates for privacy protections in financial networks. And something like Manero is just a natural fit. There's nothing to fix to comply with a privacy standard law. There's also kind of concerns about this on the American side because there are concerns that if you have a fully transparent currency like Bitcoin and you associate names and faces with accounts, that could be used to basically discriminate against groups. So that there's that too. It's like once you have names and faces associated with accounts, you could also have political parties associated with accounts, and then because this is all computerized, you could be a merchant that kind of looks up your customers' history, and if they're not in the right tribe or whatever, you can discriminate against them. So there are concerns, I think, there are many concerns from different parties about the ways in which that level of radical transparency could be undesirable. it could come from all sorts of places, right? And so that's where Manero, I think, is a natural fit, because not only will you have like the cream puff sellers deciding and figuring out on their own, hopefully not learning the hard way by having like this kind of cascade of events like we talked about, of getting shut out of the financial system just because you have been insufficiently insulated from quote unquote bad people in the Bitcoin network. So it's like the clean people are going to want to avoid that risk altogether and then go to just a more sensible system, right, where it's just value being transmitted and not value plus reputation.
Beautiful, well said, Dr. Kim. Wow. So could you please explain, maybe for the person out there that wants to be a squeaky clean investor and they want to get into Bitcoin and they want to, after hearing you speak, they realize, wow, Monero is actually better money. What steps can they take to remain compliant, to make sure that they're doing things correctly with Monero?
Sure. And this is, I know that, just the whole idea of compliance is going to kind of rub some of your listeners the wrong way.
For sure, yes.
But the reality is, as a consultant with some Wall Street experience, I was head of research at an equity manager that managed over $1 billion USD. So I'm, familiar with that world in which compliance is just, you don't even question it. Like, that's the reality.
Right.
It's like, there's no money manager out there who's going to kind of try to stick it to the man, basically. It's just, it's not realistic. Like, they're going to do, basically following the letter of the law. So, like, this category of investor who is looking to get into Manero would be comfortable using, for example, an exchange that does full KYC AML, of which in the United States there are several of these exchanges that can do the USD XMR pair. So Kraken would be the first to come to mind for US investors. There's also the OTC market, so for those investors with higher ticket amounts. So a rough rule of thumb would be like $100,000 minimum trade size. In that kind of league, you are looking at more bespoke service rather than signing up at a website and kind of like learning your own buy and sell interface. This would be more high-touch service in which you would be, after onboarding, and again going through the full KYC AML process with the OTC desk, investors at this level would be kind of in touch with traders directly, either through something like Skype or even telephone. It's getting done these days. And if those transactions, larger transactions, can get done with a pre-settled upon price and then post-settlement. So in other words, you'd have the OTC desk and you'd have the investor as the counterparty. The investor who is interested in buying or selling Manero would make that known to the OTC desk. They would come back with a quote. If the investor likes the quote, they'd say okay. Then the terms of the deal at that point were set, even though nothing's changed hands. Then after the deal is set, at that point the investor would send their fiat for Manero to the OTC desk, and then upon receipt, the OTC desk would send the other currency back. So actually in the US there are at least five OTC desks that maintain transactions for USD XMR. So like just to name them off the top of my head, there's DB Chain based in Chicago. There's Circle OTC based in Boston. Let's see, there's Kraken OTC. They're currently based in San Francisco. There's also Galaxy Digital in New York, and let's see, Cumberland Mining would be the fifth one. There may be others that I'm unaware of, but this kind of goes counter to the argument that I also often hear from people who are maybe more entrenched on the Bitcoin side, which is there's no liquidity in something like Manero. Well, with 5 OTC desks to choose from, I would say that investors in the high ticket range have a a multitude of choices, all of which are US based, fully compliant with the US KYC AML law. So for those investors who are comfortable with going through that onboarding process, there's lots of options.
It's interesting how much ignorance there is that drives the market with fear towards privacy coins, right? What would you say to anyone listening, maybe any CEOs from any exchanges or anyone that has been tempted throughout the world to maybe not service a privacy coin like Monero?
Sure. So one area of society in which I think it's very uncontroversial that secrecy is important is in the realm of businesses and trade secrets.
Right.
So for example, nobody thinks that because Coca-Cola takes great pains to protect its secret formula, that there must be something shady going on at Coca-Cola. Everyone just understands that this is secret information that they need to keep secret in order to preserve their business model. There's no kind of nefarious activity associated with that. Likewise, for a business that's trying to keep its supplier and customer data close to its vest, there's also not immediate suspicion that the company is up to doing something wrong, right? So any company that has suppliers, they're going to want to keep the details of who the suppliers are, when they're doing their orders, how much they're ordering at a time, what the price is that they're getting from their suppliers. That's part of their kind of operational secret, like to putting together a company that can deliver a profit. It's like those decisions that go into that sort of end bottom line of does the company make a profit or not. Likewise, data on the customers, like how much are they charging customers? Are they charging all customers the same, or are they differentiating their products? Who are their customers? How many of them are them? You see this kind of data aggregated on quarterly accounting statements, right? But you don't see like the granular data, and that granular data is part of the company's secret sauce. Nobody automatically assumes that there's something shady. So the thing is with Bitcoin, all of these self-defense mechanisms that we all kind of think are quite reasonable for any company to take part in, they go away if they engage in commerce with a transparent coin like Bitcoin. You can see who the suppliers are. You can see who the customers are. You can see exactly who paid what. You can see exactly when they paid, right? And then you can even kind of follow the money. You can go to the supplier. All this is possible. Even things like internal HR. So I mentioned this kind of example at Acapulco a few months ago. That is, let's say you're a company that works, that is on board the crypto train, and you're using Bitcoin to pay your employees. Well, now you think of yourself as one of those employees, right? Like Friday comes along, it's payday, you got your Bitcoin from your employer. But here's the thing, it's not just Bitcoin you got like a whole lot of information along with your paycheck, because you can see the address from which the Bitcoin got sent. In other words, you can see your boss's account. So, hey, let's type in my boss's account into a block explorer. Oh, well, I see that my payday transaction is there. But hey, look, it's like 20 other payday transactions. Well, you don't know they're payday transactions, but they happen to happen on Friday afternoon at the same time you got paid. And they happen to be like roughly the same amount. So you can kind of figure that they're probably payroll, right? Now you're invited. It's like one step leads to another. Now you're curious. Like what's Fred making? Like in the cubicle next to me, right? It becomes like a little challenge to like put little pieces of data together. Basically, the Bitcoin the transparency invites voyeurism. It invites people to be to snoop around, right? And so this is kind of it's hard for me to understand, but it's kind of celebrated by some in Bitcoin as being a feature, not a bug, because now we're in this world where everything's transparent. I think that it's kind of naive to think that the institutions of power will have a state in which the powerful institutions themselves are transparent and yet they reserve the civil liberty of privacy for their citizens, I think it's much more likely that the powerful institutions would keep private transactions to themselves and require the little guy to be completely public.
Correct, especially now having the alternative of Monero in the market, which is not going anywhere. So do you, do you have any forecasts of the future as to what these powerful institutions will decide as their means to transact value and what they would allow for the masses to have? Do you maybe see a future where the powerful use Monero and they make everyone else use a surveillance coin?
Yeah, I guess, I'm kind of speaking maybe generally and not quite in terms of like adoption of certain projects by governments, for example, but I think my point is just to challenge kind of some commonly thrown out maybe projections of like desired futures on the part of some in the crypto community. I think that as far as Monero's future is concerned, I think there's a First Amendment attribute to much of this that, at least as an American, is highly relevant to the situation. So one thing that is revolutionary about the ideas in the Nakamoto white paper was the very idea of ownership. So because ownership of a Bitcoin address, or for example, a Manero address, is tantamount to knowledge of the private key that is needed to unlock spending of the value token in the associated public key address. So now we have a situation in which knowledge is money. Right? It's a opposite of the Citizens United case that the Supreme Court decided, which came to the conclusion that money is a form of speech. Therefore, we don't want to regulate too much the ability of people to donate money to political campaigns because that's a form of speech. And if you curtail that too much, you're limiting their free speech. So this is the opposite. Now we have a situation in which knowledge of a sequence of ones and zeros, right? Just a number. Knowledge of a number in cryptographic cryptocurrency systems is tantamount to possession of money. So there are First Amendment, I think, implications to this. So, for example, does it make sense for there to be a regulation or a law that says knowledge of a sequence of bits that unlocks the spending of a transparent value is okay, but knowledge of a different sequence of bits that unlocks the spending of a private currency like Manero is not okay? Like if you try to put yourself in the shoes of a regulator or a lawmaker, how exactly are you going to write that? And also, how exactly are you going to write that in a way that doesn't sound completely hokey when it gets challenged, right? Because at the end, we're talking about a constitutionally protected right to free speech. There's also free association as well.
Right.
In other words, that people have the right to associate with groups and not be kind of painted in the same brush as everyone in the group. People are individuals. So I think there's often a lot of sort of simplistic thinking about, Monero's going to get banned. Well, if you think through the details of how does that ban happen, like for example in the US, if it happened at the executive branch level, if it was like a presidential declaration, it might stick immediately, but if there was opposition to it at the legislative level, Congress could pass a law to kind of counter it. Or I think what is more likely is that you'll see basically the cryptocurrency community mobilize to present a legal challenge to any sort of declaration like that is legitimately an assault on First Amendment rights. And so I think eventually something like that would go to the Supreme Court, which would need to consider the question, do Americans have a fundamental right to exchange value privately? I don't know how that question would go down. I would think that the ideals under which America was founded would make that a question that I think most reasonable people would think that yes. we do, we should.
Right. Yeah, you were saying?
Oh, the other thing is that the phrase exercise your First Amendment right, it means exercise, which implies that you don't just sit on your couch eating Cheetos, right? Like it's an exercise that you need to exercise your First Amendment right. And at least to me, owning Manero or advising clients to consider Manero is an exercise in First Amendment rights. Like you need to take steps to exercise your First Amendment rights or they might get taken away.
Right on. Now, we've been talking about Monero. We're at the Monero Village at DEF CON. Are there any other cryptocurrencies that you are excited about, or as excited about as you are about Monero?
I look, but I'm not finding any.
Wow.
It's it's surprisingly difficult, I think, to get money right. So here's one thing. It's like there's thousands of projects out there. Most of them tried to do something. So in the Bitcoin white paper, the data that is put on the blockchain is an accounting system of value, basically a form of money. There are lots of other projects that seek to put other sorts of data right on the blockchain. Those I find to be of maybe some academic interest, but I think it's premature because I think the killer use case of blockchain is money. Like it's the most natural application, and it's simple enough to be kind of the litmus test by which we can judge, is this blockchain stuff actually useful to humanity or is it not? So if money can get figured out, like in other words, I'm saying that let's figure out money with blockchains first before trying to do all sorts of other ideas.
I completely agree with you. I can't agree enough with you. When people talk about the DAO and the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, there's no more important DAO than money. When people talk about a smart contract, there's no more important smart contract than monetary exchange, right? I mean, so we need to get that one down. And I agree, Monero is at the Crypto Vigilante and the Dollar Vigilante, we love Monero. And we really look forward to having you back at Anarchapulco and Cryptopulco, and maybe even at the TVV Wealth Summit. Yeah, thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Kim.
It's a good interview.
And anywhere people can find you online, follow what you're doing.
I'm Daniel at Sweetwater.consulting for anyone who wants to talk about how I might be able to help them. I'm also doing some interesting work, I think, and somewhat unique within the cryptocurrency community, in that I'm forming some alliances within the estate planning and trust world. So this is setting up legal structures and protections to ensure that the intent of cryptocurrency owners is followed in the very long term. And so it turns out that there are some jurisdictions within the US that are more receptive to having trust funds be put into cryptocurrency. And so I'm looking forward to helping kind of a couple different constituencies with this interfacing and liaison that I'm currently doing. One would be people who have gained wealth in crypto and now are, for the first time, looking to trust and estate law to help them further their kind of personal missions of what sort of legacy they have to leave with their wealth. The other constituency would be people who establish trusts in crypto-friendly jurisdictions who under which that the initial funds were obtained through a non-crypto fund, like basically a CEO who takes a company from infancy and takes it public, and now sets up a family office to deal with that. There's interest among that subset of investors to get into cryptocurrency, but of course, coming from traditional finance, it's an overwhelming task to figure out what is happening in cryptocurrency, since the barriers of entry to new competing cryptocurrencies is zero, right? It's just like Linux, like nobody has to ask permission to come up with your own flavor of Linux because it's free and open source software. It's exactly the same situation in cryptocurrency, and so this leads to this rather overwhelming situation for people coming into crypto from the traditional finance world. And also because of my hedge fund experience, I'm completely comfortable speaking their language. I showed several plots and charts in my talk here at DEF CON that went over things like correlation structure with US stocks and bonds, looking at Monero and Bitcoin in that context. One interesting result was that the correlation coefficient between Manero and US stocks is extremely low. It's on the order of like 0.02. And then with US fixed income, like AGG, it's actually negative, slightly negative. This is taking a time period from the inception of Manero to the present, using that time period. And so, of course, within the world of institutional finance, what everybody is after is uncorrelated alpha. So this is consistent with modern portfolio theory, which again was another economics Nobel Prize, Markowitz, I believe it's 1958, if I remember right. But the idea is that if you have two assets that basically don't wiggle up and down together, and then you add them together, then the resulting wiggle that you get from the combined is less. You can reduce your portfolio level risk by including assets that do not correlate. Right? And so this historically has been the case with cryptocurrency and traditional investments. And the other thing is that correlation structure tends to persist. Like it's still bogus to say they were uncorrelated in the past, therefore they will be uncorrelated in the future, right?
Right.
Like that is a kind of a
pretense of knowledge.
Yes, that's an investing kind of faux pas to make that assumption. But it's a less bad assumption to say that the returns were fantastic before and therefore tomorrow's returns will be fantastic. That's a much worse assumption.
Right.
So the correlation assumption is slightly better, which means that even though crypto and traditional assets have had historically low correlation, and one can be maybe slightly comfortable with the idea of making a assumption that this will continue in the future, a correlation structure. That still does not excuse the investor from needing to make their own assessment of the appreciation potential of any given crypto asset. Right? In other words, one needs to come up with one's own expected probability distribution of future price outcomes. It's not just so in other words, if you get a uncorrelated asset which goes to zero, that's not going to help your portfolio, obviously, right? So like a lack of correlation is good, but you still need to do the task of figuring out some way of coming to your own conclusion of whether you think an asset is under or overvalued. So on that line, there's a chart I showed at Acapulco, which showed a long-term chart from 2009 to the present of the value of all the world's Bitcoin divided by the value of all the world's gold. So this gives you a ratio, right? Like in real estate, you'd be like comparing two houses. You don't like the question of, is this house fairly priced? You need more information. You need to know, well, what would I pay for kind of a similar house? Like if you just are given a house and a dollar value and no other information, it's hard to assess whether it's a good deal or not, right? And so I think that's also true with any asset and with crypto as well. The thing is that the way that decentralized digital scarcity works in the Bitcoin white paper and also in Manero is that it really acts sort of like a form of digital gold. And this is something you often hear from the people in Bitcoin. Well, Bitcoin is digital gold. Well, the thing is that if you flip a gold bar over on its head, you don't see like a nice clean list of everybody who owned that gold bar for all of history. So the question of what crypto asset is actually most functionally similar to gold, it'd have to be Manero. And so if you look at the price chart that I just mentioned, so in other words, the value of all Bitcoin versus the value of all gold, and then the value of all Manero versus divided by the value of all the world's gold. At CryptoCola 2019, the answer was that the world's gold was worth about 100 times the world's Bitcoin, and the world's gold was worth about 10,000 times all the world's Manero, in which the more apt conclusion, or the more apt comparison would be Manero to gold. So I think that is a useful metric to keep in mind when coming up with one's own conclusion as to what's undervalued. And since then now, so if you update that with current prices, then of course because of the bull market that's happened since the beginning of this year, now we're looking at it's more like 400. Like 40. The world's gold is currently worth about 40 times all the world's Bitcoin, and on the Manero side, it's more like 4,000. So, in other words, all the world's Manero is worth about 1/4,000 of all the world's gold.
Wow.
And if you consider, so you can like interpret that a couple different ways, right? If you're a bit skeptical towards crypto, you might see the gold price as being sort of a ceiling. Like there's no way this crypto is going to actually exceed the price of gold.
Right.
But the other way you could look at it is that this is gold that understands the internet. Right? So, people have tried to stick an Ethernet port on a bar of gold. It didn't really work very well. So it's sort of a fatal flaw in today's society where everything is networked. So the other way to see it is that, the price of gold could actually be like a floor for an asset that actually behaves like gold, and yet on top of that has the ability to understand this modern marvel that we call the internet.
Wow, incredible. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Kim. And we really look forward to having you at CryptoCola, Anarcho, and I'm going to push to have you at the TDB Wealth Summit for sure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks again.
Yes, thank you.
I'm trying to tell ya, this the event of the year and best vacation ever. Ryan Potter, Jeffrey Tucker, just to name a few. Get your tickets, you don't want to miss it. You should roll through, talking politics to health and self-improvement to investing. So many things, not one thing. Learn how to live life unchained, yeah. 4 days vibing on the beach, time to connect. All about growth, way more than a conference. This is Nakamoto, yeah. Let's go.
You ain't seen nothing yet.